The first thing I noticed about him was that he always pressed 9 himself, even if someone else had already pressed it. It didn't matter if I was standing right behind him with my thumb halfway to the panel. His hand got there first, quick, almost absent-minded, like a man closing a door out of habit rather than need. I used to think it was just a tic. It took me years to understand it was the opposite of a tic. It was the one thing about him that was never accidental. I turned down the promotion in March of my 4th year. My supervisor asked me, twice, in 2 different meetings, why I would say no to a title, a raise, and a corner office on the 14th floor, and both times I gave her a version of the truth that left out the only part that mattered. I said I liked editorial work more than I'd like managing a marketing team. That was true. I just didn't say the rest of it, which was that the job would have moved me 5 floors up, into a different elevator bank entirely, away from a man I saw for maybe 11 minutes a day, and had built, without ever naming it, an entire private life around. That's the whole shape of this story, really. I stayed on a floor for a man I never touched, for reasons neither of us ever said out loud, and I've never told anyone the real one, until now. I should start with how it began. Because the order matters. If I give you the ending first, you'll think this was always about romance, and it wasn't. Not in any way you'd recognize from the word. It was about something quieter, and, in its own way, harder to carry. My name is Vivian Hale. I was 23 when I started at Merrow and Finch, a mid-sized publishing house in Chicago that did serious literary fiction and the occasional surprise bestseller, housed in an old building on Wabash with brass elevator doors that never quite closed on the first try. I'd come out of a master's program in editing with more debt than confidence, and I took the first offer I got, which was an editorial assistant position on the 9th floor under a senior editor named Julian Ashcroft. I want to say, before anything else, that I was good at the job. I want to say it early, the way you'd want it said about you, because everything that follows might make it sound like the job was incidental to me, and it wasn't. I loved manuscripts. I still do. That part of this was always real, independent of him. Julian was 46 when I met him. Editor-in-chief of literary fiction, second name most people thought of when they thought of the house, though his actual title was smaller than his reputation. He had a way of reading a manuscript that I'd never seen anyone else do. Slowly, almost suspiciously. Like the pages owed him something and he was deciding whether to collect. He hired me off a stack of maybe 40 applications, and on my first day he said the only thing about my qualifications he ever really said, "Your margin notes on the writing sample were better than the writing sample. Most people's aren't." That was it. I went home that night and read it again like a fortune. He was married. I want to name that here, at the start. The way you'd name it if you were telling this honestly and not romantically. Because everything that follows only makes sense with that fact sitting in plain view the whole time, not hidden in a later reveal. His wife's name was Nora. I'll leave the rest of her out of it, some old privacy instinct I still keep even now, and they'd been married 21 years by the time I arrived. There was a photograph on his desk of the two of them on a dock somewhere, her laughing at something outside the frame. A look on her face I studied more times over the years than I probably studied any single object in that entire office. Not out of envy. Most days. Just trying, I think, to understand the shape of the life sitting just beside the one I was building around its edges. The ritual that ended up mattering most started by accident. The way rituals do before you notice they've become rituals. 3 months into the job, I stayed late on a Friday finishing red-line notes on a debut novel neither of us could stop talking about, and he stopped by my desk with his coat already half on and said, "You're doing that wrong. Come here, let me show you what a real second pass looks like." That became Fridays. Not officially. Nothing about it was ever put on a calendar, ever announced to anyone. But for 6 years, nearly every Friday afternoon, he'd pull a chair up to my desk after most of the floor had cleared out, and we'd go through a manuscript together until the light outside changed color. He had a habit, during those sessions, of clicking the same mechanical pencil 3 times before he started writing. Never once, never twice, always 3. A habit I found strange the first year, and then noticed somewhere in the third that I'd started doing myself, unconsciously, with my own pencil, at my own desk, alone. That was the first motif, if I can call it that. The pencil clicked 3 times. The second was the elevator. 9, pressed by his hand, every single time, whether I'd already reached for it or not. I used to tease him about it once. Early on, I do know how to work an elevator button, Julian. And he said, without much of a pause, force of habit. I like knowing the floor's decided before the doors open. I laughed it off. I didn't understand, for years, that he meant something considerably larger by that sentence than the sentence itself let on. The third thing I noticed slower, because it took longer to see it as a pattern instead of a coincidence. He never once, in 6 years, asked me a personal question I hadn't opened the door to myself. He'd ask about a manuscript, a deadline, a writer I'd mentioned once at a holiday party, and remembered, unprompted, 4 months later. He never asked whether I was seeing anyone. He never asked why I sometimes came in on Mondays with my eyes rimmed red. He waited, always, for me to bring it, if I wanted to bring it at all. It took me a long time to understand that this wasn't distance. It was the opposite of distance, wearing distance's clothes. I need to say plainly what the gap between us actually was, because it's the whole architecture of the thing, and I've heard enough people flatten stories like mine into something simpler than they were. He was, functionally, my superior, not my direct manager on paper. Our reporting lines were more tangled than that, but everyone on the floor understood whose opinion of my work would eventually decide whether I kept advancing at that company. I was 23, then 26, then 29. He was a married man in his late 40s with 2 kids in high school and 20-some years of a life that existed entirely apart from the 9th floor. Neither of us ever pretended the gap wasn't there. We built whatever this was in the narrow space directly beside it, and neither of us, for 6 years, ever leaned on it. Somewhere around my 3rd year, I started noticing the smaller things. The way he'd glance up when I walked past his open office door, even mid-sentence with someone else, for less than a second, and then go right back to what he was saying without missing a beat. The way he restructured his own Friday schedule, more than once, so nothing ever bumped our session, even when letting it slide would have been the easier and more professional choice. The way that once, late on a Thursday, finishing a jacket copy deadline together, he stood close enough at the shared monitor that neither of us moved for what was probably 4 full seconds too long, and neither of us mentioned it after. Priya, a copy editor 2 desks down, sharp in the specific way of someone who notices everything and says most of it, asked me directly once, in the break room, stirring sweetener into coffee she never actually drank. "You and Ashcroft," she said. "I'm not saying it's anything. I'm saying it's something. Nobody else gets a standing Friday." I gave her the rehearsed answer before I even knew I had one ready. He's a good editor. I got lucky with my mentor. She looked at me a beat too long and let it go, the way people do when they've decided the question isn't worth the friendship. I've thought about that exchange more than almost anything else from those years, how I handed her the true thing and the false thing in the exact same sentence, and didn't even notice myself doing it until much later. Here's what I privately believed, during that stretch, though I want to be honest that I was never certain of it, not close to certain. and I think he'd say the same if he were the one narrating this instead of me. I believed he had built, somewhere private in himself, a version of caring about me that he had decided, deliberately, would never be permitted to become anything else. Not repression, I don't think it was that. I think he'd looked at it clearly, the way he looked at every manuscript, and made a decision, and then quietly remade that same decision every Friday for 6 years, without ever needing my help to make it. I believed the Fridays were, for him, a controlled, rationed amount of something he would otherwise have had to give up entirely. And I believed, this is the part I was least sure of, that some portion of what he felt toward me wasn't really about me specifically, but about some earlier version of himself, before the mortgage and the masthead and the 2 decades. That he got to visit for 90 minutes a week without having to explain the visit to anyone, including himself. I could be wrong about every part of that. I want to say so plainly, because I never once asked him outright, and he never once told me outright, and everything I've described is a story I built to live inside a silence I couldn't interrogate without ending the thing I was trying to understand. The obstacle was never a mystery, and I don't want to make it sound like one, because that would dress this up as more mysterious than it deserves to be. The obstacle was Nora, and the 2 kids, and 21 years, and the plain fact that whatever else he was to me, he was a decent man who'd made vows and meant to keep every one of them. He didn't complain about his marriage to me, ever, not once, in 6 years. If anything, he mentioned Nora more than the conversation required, a habit I understood eventually as its own kind of fence, deliberately built and deliberately maintained, brick by small brick, every single Friday. There was one evening, in my 4th year, when the fence was tested without either of us choosing it. We'd stayed past 9 finishing line edits on a novel we were both, privately, prouder of than we should have let ourselves be, and by the time we looked up the floor was dark except for his desk lamp and my monitor's glow, and it was raining hard enough against the windows that neither of us wanted to be the one to suggest leaving. We stood by the window for a while afterward, not talking, watching the wet street 9 floors down. He was close enough that closing the distance would have taken less than a second, and I understood, with a stillness I still remember exactly, that he knew that too, and that we were both choosing in real time, breath by breath, not to. Neither of us said a word about it afterward. We collected our coats when the rain thinned, and he held the door for the elevator and pressed 9, and that was that. I didn't understand, standing there that night, what any of it would eventually cost either of us, or what it would eventually reveal. I only understood that something had been offered and declined by both of us at once, without a single spoken word, and that this exact, quiet, mutual refusal was somehow the realest thing that had ever passed between 2 people I'd been part of. There's a scene from my 2nd year I haven't told you yet, because I've circled it in my head longer than any other single memory from that office, and I think I finally have to stop circling. It was late January, the kind of Chicago cold that makes the whole city move faster and talk less. We were deep into a Friday session, working through a manuscript by a debut novelist we both believed in more than the sales projections did, and halfway through he asked me, without any lead-up, whether I'd ever regretted taking the assistant job at Merrow and Finch instead of the offer I'd had from a bigger house downtown, one with an imprint everyone recognized. One that would have paid better and looked better on the resume I hadn't built yet. I told him no. He asked why. I said something honest before I'd fully decided to say it, because there I'd have been one of 40 assistants. Here, someone actually read my notes. He didn't answer right away. He turned his mechanical pencil over once in his fingers, not the 3 clicks. Something new, something I'd never seen him do before or after, and said, I read your notes before you'd written anything worth being noticed for. I read your writing sample twice before I ever met you. I laughed it off, said something about him just being a thorough hirer, and he let me laugh it off. The way he always let me redirect when I needed room to. I only understood, hours later, lying awake, that he'd clicked nothing before he said it, which was somehow louder than if he had. The eyebrow-raise scene came that spring, and it wasn't Priya this time. It was Desmond, one of the senior editors, a man in his 60s who'd been at the house since it still had a different name on the door. We were in an acquisitions meeting, the four of us at the table, and at some point Julian deferred to me on a structural note he could easily have made himself, framing it as, "Vivian actually spotted that, ask her." After the meeting broke, Desmond lingered by the door and said, not unkindly, "You let her carry a lot of your calls, Julian." Julian didn't answer immediately. "Then, she's earned the calls." Desmond looked between the two of us for a second, not suspicious exactly, more like a man doing arithmetic he'd rather not finish out loud, and then just nodded and moved on. I stood there afterward gathering my folders, feeling like something had been said in a language just adjacent to English, close enough that I'd caught its shape without any of its actual words. I had my own private theories, across those years, about what any of it meant, and I want to be honest about the ones I eventually decided were wrong. For a long stretch I believed he simply liked being needed, that mentoring me fed something in him that had nothing specifically to do with me. That I was interchangeable with any promising 23-year-old who'd walked in that particular year. I believed that for the better part of a year, and I think, if I'm honest, it was a story I built on purpose, because it hurt less than the alternative. I let go of it the week I got engaged, briefly, to someone else. I haven't mentioned Grant yet, and I want to include him here, because leaving him out would make this story cleaner than it actually was, and it doesn't deserve to be clean. Grant and I were together almost 2 years, starting in my 3rd year at the house. He was steady and kind and wanted very badly to marry me, and I said yes for about 3 weeks before I told him I couldn't do it. And I never fully explained why to him, or to myself, until much later. What I remember most clearly from that period is one Friday, a week after the engagement, when Julian asked, in his careful, non-asking way, how things had been going, and I told him I was engaged, and watched him take it in without a single visible shift in his face, and then watched him say, "Congratulations, he's a lucky man." In a voice so level it told me everything by how much effort the levelness clearly cost him. I broke it off with Grant 17 days later. I told Grant it was about timing, about not feeling ready. I've never told anyone, until this, that some part of me broke it off, because I couldn't tolerate the exact quiet that had settled over Julian's face for half a second before he said congratulations, and I didn't want to be the reason that particular look became permanent. That's the part of this I'm least proud of, if I'm being honest with you. I let a decision that size get shaped by a man who never once asked me to shape anything around him. He didn't know. I made certain he never knew. That was its own kind of dishonesty, not to him, but to Grant, who deserved a reason that was actually about him, and not about a man 5 floors and 1 elevator ride away. The window night wasn't the only obstacle-tested scene, either. There was a second one, quieter, that I think matters more precisely, because nothing about it looked like anything to anyone watching from outside it. We'd traveled together to a regional book fair in Milwaukee, just the two of us, representing the house. A trip that had been assigned by someone else entirely and carried no intention on either of our parts. The fair ran long, and by the time the last panel ended, we'd missed the train back and ended up with a 2-hour wait at a nearly empty station, sitting on a bench under fluorescent light that made everything look slightly underwater. We didn't talk much at first. Then, Without the pencil click, without any preamble at all, he said, I think about what year this would have needed to be for this to be simpler. I asked what he meant, though I already knew. A year before I met Nora, he said, or 20 years from now, maybe, if we're both still. He stopped himself there. Didn't finish it. Looked instead at the empty tracks. I didn't finish it for him. We sat like that a while longer, in a silence that felt less like absence and more like something being deliberately held in place by both of us at once. And then the announcement board updated, and we stood, and neither of us ever mentioned that unfinished sentence again. I want to say plainly, I don't think either version of that sentence, the year before, the 20 years from now, was ever going to happen, and I don't think he believed it would either. I think he needed to say it once, out loud, to something other than himself, and I happened to be the only person available to hear it. That's not romance. That's just what it costs a careful man to carry something for a long time without ever once setting it down in front of anyone. There's one more scene from that stretch I've been avoiding telling you, not because it's more dramatic than the others, but because it's the one that makes me look worst, and I promised myself, starting this, that I wouldn't only tell you the parts that flatter me. It was my 27th birthday, a Thursday, which meant the office threw the kind of small, half-hearted party that offices throw. A sheet cake from the grocery store downstairs, a card that had circulated the floor all week for people to sign. Julian signed it last, I noticed, after everyone else had already scattered back to their desks. He didn't write anything long. Just keep reading the way you read, J.A. I still have that card. I've never told anyone that. That night, a small group of us went out for drinks, the kind of loose, low-stakes office gathering that happens after a birthday. And somewhere around the second round, Priya, 3 glasses in and considerably less careful than usual, leaned across the table and said, loud enough that at least 2 other people heard it, "Okay, but for real, Vivian, if Ashcroft wasn't married, would you?" She didn't even finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The table went quiet for exactly as long as it takes a group of people to collectively decide whether to laugh it off or let it sit. I laughed it off. I said something about how flattering it was that people thought a 50-year-old man in reading glasses was my type, and the table laughed, genuinely, and moved on, the way rooms do when you hand them a good enough joke at the right moment. But I remember, with a clarity that still unsettles me a little, that my hands were perfectly steady the entire time I said it, and that the steadiness itself was the tell, if anyone had been paying close enough attention, the kind of steadiness you only have when you've rehearsed a deflection so many times in your own head that your body no longer registers it as a lie. I told Julian about the birthday card the following Friday, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with how much it had meant to me. I said, "Thank you for the card." It was the best one I got, if I'm honest, and everyone else wrote considerably more. He didn't look up right away from the manuscript in front of him. When he did, he said, "I try not to write more than I mean." I understood, even then, that the sentence was doing 2 jobs at once, one about birthday cards, and one about everything else neither of us had ever said aloud. I let it sit there without pushing on it, the way I'd learned to with him, the way you learn to leave certain doors exactly as ajar as someone else left them. There was also, that same year, a work trip to New York, the annual sales conference, a whole floor of a midtown hotel taken over by 5 different publishing houses for 3 days of panels and forced networking. Julian and I ended up, by pure scheduling accident, on adjoining rooms, a detail neither of us commented on when we noticed the room numbers, but that both of us clearly noticed, because I remember the specific silence that followed when he glanced at his keycard and then at mine. The second night, unable to sleep, Jet-lagged, though the flight was barely 90 minutes, I heard him in the hallway near midnight and opened my door before I'd fully decided to. He was standing near the ice machine, still in his conference clothes, tie loosened, looking like a man who also hadn't been sleeping. "Can't sleep either," I said. "Not a question." "Not particularly," he said. We stood there for a moment in the fluorescent hallway light, the ice machine humming between us, neither of us moving toward the other, neither of us moving away. "I keep thinking about the Hendricks manuscript," he said finally, which was true, and which was also, we both understood, not remotely what either of us had actually been lying awake thinking about. The third act doesn't earn its ending yet. "I've been thinking the same thing," I said, which was also true, and also not the whole truth. We talked about the manuscript for maybe 10 minutes, standing in that hallway. And then he said goodnight, and I said goodnight, and we each went back into our own room, and I lay awake afterward listening for any sound through the wall, and heard nothing, and understood that the nothing was its own kind of answer, that whatever might have happened in a version of that night with fewer scruples in it wasn't going to happen in this one, because neither of us was built, or willing to be built, that way. I want to tell you honestly that I don't know, even now, whether he lay awake on his side of that wall the way I lay awake on mine. I've never asked. Some things, even in the telling of this, I still don't feel entitled to know for certain. Julian retired the spring I turned 30, 4 months after I'd turned down the promotion to marketing. It wasn't sudden, nothing about him ever was, but it still landed like something dropped from a height I hadn't measured properly until it hit. He announced it at a Monday meeting in his usual even voice, said something about Nora's mother needing more care out in Winnetka, about wanting to be present while his kids were still coming home for holidays instead of just Thanksgiving, about 28 years being enough for one man to give one company. People clapped. Someone in the back cried a little. Not me, though I remember concentrating very hard on the folder in my hands to make sure of that. The Fridays didn't stop right away. We had maybe 5 more of them in that strange final stretch, each one a little more careful than the last, both of us aware of a clock neither of us mentioned once. On the last one, he clicked his pencil only twice before he started writing. I noticed and said nothing. I think now he simply forgot, for once in 6 years, and I think the forgetting told me more than getting it exactly right ever could have, that the ritual had never really been about the pencil. He gave me his personal email on an index card, the same size and stock he used for his manuscript notes, and said, "For when you edit something you actually believe in and want a second opinion from someone who isn't on payroll anymore." I kept that card in the drawer with my passport for the next 2 years, which tells you something about where I filed him, mentally, somewhere reserved for things I might need suddenly and couldn't afford to misplace. I told myself, in the years that followed, a version of our history that I understand now was mostly a story I needed in order to keep functioning at that desk without him 5 floors down. I told myself it had been mentorship, purely, nothing else, nothing more, and that whatever I'd felt at the window that rainy night, or on that station bench in Milwaukee, was a 20-something's confusion about attention, easily mistaken for something larger. I told myself Priya's break room question had been answered honestly. I told myself the elevator button was just a habit, the pencil clicks just a tick, nothing underneath either of them worth excavating. I got promoted twice in the years after he left, not the marketing role I'd turned down, but real ones. Editorial ones, the kind I actually wanted, and I told myself each time that I'd earned them on my own, which was true, and also not the whole truth, though I didn't know that yet. The discovery happened 5 years after he retired, during a company-wide restructuring that nobody at Merrow and Finch saw coming until it was already underway. The house had been quietly losing money for 2 years, and a private equity firm bought a controlling stake and brought in consultants who spent a miserable 8 weeks deciding whose job would still exist in the new organizational chart. I made the cut. A third of editorial didn't. I found out why, almost by accident, from a woman named Corinne who'd worked in HR for over a decade and was retiring herself that same year, cleaning out files before the new ownership digitized everything and the old paper trail disappeared for good. She'd pulled me aside near the archive room with a folder in her hand, the kind of expression on her face that told me she'd been carrying something for a while and had finally run out of reasons to keep carrying it alone. "You should probably see this before I shred it," she said. "It doesn't matter anymore, legally, but I thought you'd want to know." It was a budget memo from 6 years earlier, from the year before Julian retired, back when the house had gone through its first smaller round of belt tightening. Editorial had been told to cut 1 full salary line from the literary imprint. The memo, in Julian's handwriting in the margins, showed his own proposal. Instead of eliminating my position, which was newer and cheaper and would have been the obvious easy cut, he'd offered to take an early, reduced title move himself, stepping back from editor-in-chief to senior editor a year before he'd planned to, taking the pay cut that came with it, so that the salary math worked without touching my line at all. There was a second document behind it, a formal internal transfer request he'd filed and then, a week later, quietly withdrawn, a request to move to the 14th floor, to a smaller imprint with less prestige and less pressure, the kind of lateral move a tired man makes near the end of a career. Attached to it, in pencil, in his handwriting, withdrawing this. Staying on 9. Reasons my own. I stood in that archive room for a long time before I said anything to Corinne. Long enough that she touched my arm once, gently, and said she'd leave me with it. I understood, reading it twice, what it actually meant. He hadn't just protected my job during the first round of cuts by quietly taking a demotion no one made him take. He'd also, a year before that, considered moving himself off the 9th floor entirely, away from me, away from the Fridays, presumably towards something simpler for both of us, and had withdrawn the request at the last minute. In his own hand, for reasons he'd never once explained to anyone, including, it seemed, himself on paper. I hadn't planned to bring the folder that day. I'd meant driving out to Winnetka to simply see him, to have an ordinary visit, the kind 2 old colleagues have, and let the folder stay where Corinne had found it, unexamined between us. But it sat on the passenger seat the entire drive, and by the time I pulled into his driveway, I understood I'd never really had a choice about whether to bring it inside. Some decisions get made long before you admit you've made them. Nora answered the door. I hadn't seen her in over 5 years, since a holiday party where I'd shaken her hand and said something forgettable about how much I admired the house's fall list. She looked well, older, obviously, the way we all were, but well, unhurried in the way of someone who has made peace with most of what her life turned out to be. She hugged me, which surprised me, and said, "He talks about your work more than he'd probably want me to admit to you." I didn't know what to do with that sentence, standing on her porch, so I just thanked her, and she led me through to the back, where Julian was already sitting with 2 glasses of iced tea poured, one for himself, and one, apparently, in anticipation of me. I want to tell you about the first hour of that visit before I tell you about the folder, because I think the ordinariness of it matters. We talked about his sons, one in Denver now, married, expecting a first child, the other still finding his footing, the kind of thing parents say gently about a grown child they still worry over. We talked about a novel I was editing, a debut I was nervous about, and he asked the kind of questions he used to ask on Fridays, not about plot, but about whether the writer trusted her own sentences yet, whether I'd told her so directly. We talked about nothing that mattered and everything that did. The way we always had, and for that hour I almost let myself believe I'd come only for this. It was Nora, actually, who broke the ordinariness first, without meaning to. She came out with a plate of something and said, in passing, on her way back inside, "Did you show her the thing with the transfer jewels?" I always thought she should know that, eventually, she said it lightly, the way you mentioned something you assumed had already been handled, and then she was back in the kitchen, and Julian and I were left in a silence that had, in the space of one sentence, become considerably less ordinary. "She knows," I said. "Nora knows about the transfer request?" "She's known for years," he said. "I never kept anything from her. In the sense of hiding it. I made a point of that, early on, precisely because I didn't want any part of this to exist as a secret in my marriage, whatever else it was going to be. I told her about the Fridays, in general terms, not long after they started. I told her about the transfer request the week I withdrew it. She read the memo about the salary line the year I filed it, before I ever sent it up to Desmond. He said all of this plainly, without defensiveness, the way he said everything. I think she understood what it was better than I let myself understand it, for a long time. She told me once, years ago now, that she wasn't frightened of you. She said she was frightened of what it would mean about our marriage if I had to hide it. The fact that I didn't have to was, for her, the whole answer. I sat with that for a while. It recalibrated something in me, hearing it, the understanding that I hadn't simply been the unknowing party in an arrangement built entirely out of my sight. Nora had been awake to it the whole time, in her own way, on her own terms, and had made some private peace with it that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a marriage I'd never fully get to see the inside of, and never should. That's when I set the folder on the table. He looked at it a long moment before touching it, long enough that I watched something move across his face I recognized from exactly one other moment in 6 years, standing at that rain-streaked window on the 9th floor. Not guilt. Something more like a man watching a door open that he'd built, brick by brick, specifically to keep shut, and discovering he wasn't as sorry about its opening as he'd once assumed he would be. "Corinne found it," I said, "going through old HR files before the new ownership digitizes everything. She said it didn't matter anymore. Legally, she thought I should see it before it got shredded." He opened it slowly, the way he used to open a manuscript he already half suspected would be good. Not eager, exactly. More careful, like eagerness might bruise it. He read the budget memo first, his own old handwriting in the margins, and I watched him read it the way you watch someone read a letter they wrote to themselves a decade earlier and half forgot. Then he turned to the transfer request, the one he'd filed and withdrawn a week later, and his face changed again, settling into something quieter. "I wondered if that would ever surface," he said finally. "You took a demotion so they wouldn't touch my salary line," I said. "You gave up a title you'd worked 20 years for. It was the cheaper move for the company either way," he said. "True. And also, we both understood not remotely the point. I'd been there longer. I could absorb a pay cut at that stage of my career in a way you couldn't, not with what you are still paying down." And the transfer. To 14. I made myself ask it plainly, the way he'd taught me, without meaning to, over 6 years of Friday sessions, that the real question was always worth naming directly, even when everything around it stayed indirect. Why withdraw it? He didn't answer right away. I let the silence run, the way I'd learned to with him, not filling it, not rescuing him from it. Understanding by then that his silences were never emptiness, they were construction. And construction takes exactly as long as it takes. I wrote that request on a bad week, he said eventually. I'd convinced myself that week that it would be cleaner for both of us if I simply wasn't 5 floors down every Friday anymore. Simpler for you especially. You were young. You had an entire career ahead of you that didn't need to be complicated by a man twice your seniority orbiting your desk every week. He turned his glass a quarter turn on the table, the same gesture from that January years ago, the pencil-adjacent gesture that meant something real was coming. I withdrew it the following Monday. I'd sat with it over the weekend, and Nora, without my fully realizing what she was doing, asked me a single question that undid the whole plan. She asked whether I was leaving the floor for your sake or for mine. I didn't have a good answer. I understood, sitting with that question, that running from it would have been its own kind of cowardice, dressed up as generosity toward you. So I stayed on 9. I decided that whatever this was, if it was going to exist at all, it was going to exist honestly. In the open. In the only form it was ever going to be allowed to take. Which was exactly what it already was. Fridays, nothing more. But nothing less, either. You could have told me any of this, I said. Both things. At the time. Would you have let me stay demoted if I'd told you why? He almost smiled, the closest I'd seen him come to one since I'd arrived. You'd have gone to Desmond, argued for your own line to be cut instead, made some case about seniority not being sacred. I know you. That's exactly what you'd have done. I didn't answer, because he wasn't wrong, and we both knew it. The promotion, I said instead, moving to the thing I'd actually come to ask. The one I turned down. To marketing. 14th floor. I hadn't told him about that. Not at the time, he'd already left the company by then. But I'd mentioned it once, briefly, in an email years back. No explanation attached. Did you ever wonder why I said no? He looked at me for a long moment, and I understood he already knew, the way he'd always seemed to know things about me before I'd said them aloud. I wondered, he said. I didn't let myself finish the thought. It would have moved me to 14, I said. Different floor. Different elevator bank. I'd have seen you never, not even in passing, not even for 4 seconds at a shared monitor. I heard my own voice go steadier than I expected, the way his always did, right before the real thing. I couldn't say that to my supervisor. I could barely say it to myself, so I said I liked editorial better, which was true, and left out the actual reason, which was also true. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he reached over, without any ceremony, and set 2 fingers against the folder on the table between us, not quite touching my hand. An inch short of it, the same inch that had always separated us at every window, every station bench, every shared monitor for 6 years, and said, "Then I suppose we've both been staying on the same floor for a while, in our own ways, without ever agreeing to it out loud." "I suppose we have," I said. We didn't become anything after that afternoon on the porch. I want to be honest about that, because it's the truest part of this whole account. There was no confession that reorganized either of our lives, no leaving of anyone, no beginning of anything new. He was a retired man with a wife inside making dinner and a life fully built around her, and I was a woman in her mid-30s who had just learned she'd been quietly protected at real cost by a man who never once asked her to know it, let alone repay it. What we did instead was simpler, and harder won, I think, than anything more dramatic would have been. We sat on that porch another hour, talking about a manuscript I was working on, the way we used to, and when I finally stood to leave, he walked me to my car and, out of some old habit neither of us examined, reached past me to press the door lock himself before I could. I laughed, despite myself. Some things don't change. No, he said. Some things you decide once, and then just keep deciding, quietly, for as long as it's asked of you. I still have the index card with his email on it. I still have the budget memo, a photocopy Corinne let me keep, folded now into the same drawer as my passport, next to a mechanical pencil I've never once used for anything but clicking 3 times when I need to think. I think restraint gets a bad reputation. In a world that keeps telling us love only counts if it's spoken, chaste, resolved into something you can name in a single sentence at a wedding. But some of the truest care I've ever been given came from a man who decided, over and over, quietly, not to say it, and said it anyway, in a demotion no one made him take, in a transfer request he wrote and then unwrote, in a pencil clicked 3 times, in a button pressed before I could reach it myself, for 6 years, without once asking me to notice any of it. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.